Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. I am Wendy Singer, Director of Education at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, Board of Directors, staff, and volunteers, I am honored to welcome each of you to tonight's special program. A hearty thank you to our amazing community partners who are listed on the slides in the beginning of the program. As an institution grounded in the history and lessons of the Holocaust that works to share universal lessons of humanity and generate awareness and action against injustices worldwide, it is a pleasure and honor to share this special commemorative Charlottesville program with you today. This evening, you are going to hear from three true upstanders who will speak about their personal journeys and the work that they are doing to break cycles of hate. Their presentation will leave you energized with the knowledge that there are leaders across the country taking significant action to renounce violence, promote tolerance and inclusion, and safeguard democratic values. I would now like to introduce our panelists. Christian Picciolini is an award-winning television producer, a public speaker, author, peace advocate, and a former violent extremist. Christian chronicles his involvement and exit from an early American white supremacist skinhead movement in his memoir, White American Youth. He now leads the Free Radicals Project, a global extremism prevention and disengagement network, and has helped over 300 individuals leave hate behind. He showcases his disengagement work in a second book, brand new, called Breaking Hate, Confronting the New Culture of Extremism, published in just February of 2020 by Hachette Books, as well as the MSNBC documentary series under the same name. Next, I would like to introduce Eric Ward. Eric is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between hate and violence and preserving democratic governance and inclusion society. His 30 years of leadership includes founding the Community Alliance of Lane County, establishing over 120 task forces in 6 states throughout the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, supporting immigrant rights advocates as National Field Director for the Center for New Community, serving as the Atlantic Philanthropy's U.S. Reconciliation and Human Rights Executive and Ford Foundation Program Officer, and volunteer leadership with numerous organizations. Eric's writings and speeches are widely quoted and credited with key narrative shifts in defense of inclusive democracy. Finally, I'd like to introduce Amy Spatelnick. She is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who threaten longstanding principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. IFA is backing Sines versus Kessler, the landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. The trial is scheduled for October 2020. Amy previously served as Communications Director and Senior Policy Advisor to the New York Attorney General, Communications Advisor and Spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and Communications Director in the New York State Senate. She is a Truman National Security Project Partner, a New Leaders Council faculty member, a 2017 Women in Power Fellow at the 92nd Street Y, and a 2008 Dutko Fellow for Policy and Public Service. In 2013, Amy was named a City and State 40 Under 40 Rising Star. She graduated from Tufts University. Each presenter is going to have an opportunity to speak about their work in the community. We will then open it up to a live Q&A. Tonight we are using the Zoom webinar platform. If you have a question, hover your mouse over the bottom portion of your screen or the top portion of your iPad and submit your question in the Q&A section. We will try to get to all of them, but please note there are hundreds of people on the call from around the country and even the globe. Christian, will you start us off, please?
I was saying just thank you so much to Wendy, and thanks so much to the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. It's always a real pleasure to be able to work with you. And I wanted to also acknowledge my privilege in being here, having been in the situation that I was in my experience, and I want to explain that a little bit. And also say that there are so many people of color and who are dealing with other issues who don't get the same opportunities that I do. So I want to make sure and elevate that. 29 years ago, 30 years ago, actually, when I was 14 years old, I was recruited into America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group. I was a normal kid, despite what most people might think might lead a young person to that type of environment. I came from a normal family. In fact, my family are Italian immigrants who came to the US in the mid-1960s, and were often the victims of prejudice when they came from Italy. So racism wasn't really a part of my upbringing, so it wasn't something I necessarily learned at home. However, even though I was surrounded by a lot of love, I always missed my parents because they had, as immigrants, they had to work extremely hard. We're gone 7 days a week, sometimes 14 or 16 hours a day, and was in fact raised by grandparents and aunts and uncles while they were gone. So I developed this sense of abandonment from my family that was really unwarranted because I was surrounded by a lot of love at the time. And I went looking for that elsewhere. I went looking for a sense of identity and community and purpose elsewhere, but I had been carrying this baggage of abandonment for a couple of years. And when I was 14, in 1987, I should say, maybe I'm doing my math wrong, but in 1987, when I was 14, I was standing in an alley, and I was already had been acting out as a young man. I was there smoking a joint. And a man who was twice my age walked up to me that day, and he pulled that joint from my mouth, and he looked me in the eyes, and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." And I have to be honest, at 14, I didn't know what a communist was. I didn't know if I'd met a Jewish person. I'd been raised, Catholic. And I didn't know what the word docile meant at that age. But it was the first time in my life that somebody had paid attention to me outside of my family. And he knew I was vulnerable, standing there searching for something. And he was able to reel me in with this kind of fear rhetoric that he had filled me with. I didn't understand what he was saying at first, but I was drawn by that sense of community. And, for the first time I felt seen, whereas for the first 14 years, I kind of felt invisible. And I swallowed what I was told. I believed it, and I acted on it, because I found that the more I did that, the more I was, I had this false sense of respect that I had experienced for the first time in my life. And as I was drawn in, I was complicit in acts of violence against minority groups, and also against groups from my neighborhood who happened to be white. They were the anti-fascists of the time, or we sometimes have heard the term Antifa or Antifa. Back then, 30 years ago, there was a variation of that, fighting against Nazis as well. I stayed involved for 8 years, until I was almost 23 years old. And in January of 1996, I found my way out of that movement. What led me out essentially was me sabotaging myself. While there was a lot of different moments where I had encounters with people that challenged what I had believed in, it was really the fact that I had opened a record store in 1995 to sell the racist music that I was making and importing from Europe. But at that record store, I also recognized I couldn't go apply for a business license to sell just racist music. So as cover, I was going to sell hip hop and punk rock music and heavy metal music and have a small corner of that in case anybody came snooping around. When in fact 75% of my revenue came from the racist music that I was selling. But what happened at that store was it was the first time in my life that I had had a meaningful interaction with the people that I thought I hated. And trying to be, a business person, a greedy business person, in fact, who was happy to take their money, it also exposed me to situations that were very intimate and personal that I couldn't ignore anymore. And since it was the first time I'd really had a meaningful interaction with the people that could have potentially been my victims in other circumstances, it really was their compassion that they showed me at a time I at least deserved it. Frankly, that was the most powerful thing for me. It was the best plan of attack to really change me because I couldn't deny it anymore. And when I couldn't deny the shame that I felt for selling this racist music and I removed it from the shelves, because it was 75% of my revenue, I had to close the store, unfortunately. And it took me a couple of years from that point, about 4 years from that point, to really kind of self-reflect, examine what I had been a part of. Luckily, I was able to use the closing of my record store to disengage from the movement. It was kind of a cowardly move on my part. I didn't confront it at the time. I didn't denounce what I was a part of. I just used the store closing as a way to kind of say I needed to some time to work on myself and my family. But in fact, I never really had any intention of going back. I just didn't know how to break it to them. And it took me a couple of years after that to really self-reflect and understand why I had gone in, and to understand that I needed to repair the damage that I had caused, not just run from it. And I was able to do that through an encounter with a gentleman who I had hurt in the past. In 1999, I was lucky enough to get a job opportunity, very entry-level position working for IBM, setting up computers at corporations and schools that had ordered 300 computers and needed somebody to install them, basically plug them in, power them on. And I was thrilled. I didn't have any experience doing that. I was trying to start a new life. I was running from my past. And as it turns out, the first place where they assigned me to go work was my old high school, the same one that I had been kicked out of twice for my racist activity. And suddenly I wasn't so thrilled about the opportunity anymore because it forced me to confront who I used to be. Even though I went there and I was terrified to confront it, I went there the first day and I came across a man, Mr. Holmes, who was the head of security at the high school while I was there 8 years prior. And I decided I needed to speak to him and confront the situation and apologize to him for what I had done. And when I did, he accepted my apology, but he also said that that was a really good thing for me to make me feel good. It wasn't all that great for him, that I needed to do more. And he made me promise that I would tell my story because he knew that there were other young people that maybe weren't drawn to white supremacy, who hit the same kinds of potholes that I did and were drawn into some other toxic lifestyle. But he also knew that he needed me to promise to repair and accept accountability for the damage that I had caused. And I decided at that point 20 years ago that that's what I was going to do. That's what I wanted to do, and that's what I needed to do. And since then, I have done various things in this sphere to speak up about the dangers of white supremacy, to lend some insight on how to combat it. But I've also been spending most of my energy trying to help people disengage from the same movement that I was a part of, recognizing that there were a lot of people like young me who were there, who found their way there for really no other reason other than they were searching for a sense of identity, community, and purpose. And the price of admission to get that was to kind of fall in headfirst into this movement and accept it and become who they are now. So I've been doing my best. I've helped a significant amount of people disengage from that by understanding it really isn't the ideology that necessarily draws them in. It's a whole lot of other factors, but then also hold them accountable for what they've done. I think I'll stop there because there are much more important people on this panel to speak about what they do. But I also want to thank them for being here too. I'm a big fan of both of them. Eric knows that I'm a big fan of his. And Amy, I've been watching your work very, very closely, and I'm very, very proud and super impressed of the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. And now for Eric.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is, and I am the Executive Director of Western State Center, which is a racial justice organization that works on gender and race equity based in Portland, Oregon. You know, I want to thank Christian for sharing his story. I don't want to speak a long time tonight. I really want to open up the space for Amy and Integrity First for America and some of the critical litigation work that they are involved in right now that I think is critical to this moment. What I want to do is kind of set the bridge. I think Christian's story is so important for us to hear as this conversation sets off for a couple of reasons. You know, we live in a time of intense partisanship and an intense divide, and in those kinds of moments, nuance and complexity are not sought, desired, or rewarded. At a time we exist right now in our nation that is dealing with inequality through the increase of the economic recession in this country, a cultural divide that is best experienced through reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the rise of white nationalist violence and other vigilante forms of violence. It's an important time to take stock, and the stock is remembering that at the end of the day, right, it's not about Democrats or Republicans or liberals and conservatives. It's about those of us who seek an inclusive democracy that is people-centered, transparent, and accountable, and those that are tapping into the nation's anxiety in order to foment exclusion and violence and intimidation. It's a moral question, not a political question. It's a question about which side and which vision of America we will choose. And at the end of the day, if you don't remember anything else I say in the next 8 minutes, I want you to remember this, that it doesn't matter whether you are a 68-year-old white man facing employment discrimination in northern Idaho, or whether you are a 17-year-old trans Latina facing that same form of employment discrimination in Philadelphia. Both of them and everyone in between in our nation has the right to live, love, and work free from fear and bigotry. That should be the basis of every conversation and how we understand both the challenges and the opportunities that face us today. You know, my story starts in Los Angeles. I was a kid who grew up in the punk scene in Los Angeles and Long Beach, California. It was also a time of great change in our society. I went to school at a time where desegregation was just getting underway in Long Beach, California, and going to junior high school every day simply meant this, that when I got off the public school bus after a 45 to an hour trip, right, to school at 7 in the morning, to walk the final 4 or 5 blocks to school, that I could expect to regularly be greeted by folks driving by their cars, right, screaming, monkey, Africa, you know, go back to Africa, some of the most viral statements that I think all of us can imagine. Now remember, right, this is not a 21-year-old, right? I'm a kid in 7th grade walking through a neighborhood that I don't know to and from school. It happened so much to me and others, and we never once thought about telling our parents or telling administrators. It was simply the way things were. It is what it meant for us as kids to go back and forth to school. That continued through my junior high school experience, right? And these weren't children that were screaming these things. These were grown adults shouting at a 7th grader. This did not happen in Alabama or Mississippi. This was Southern California, right, in the late 70s and the early 80s. That is what framed my understanding of race early on, and how I chose to respond to racism. In the 80s, I moved up to California, from California to Oregon. Before me was another individual who had moved up. His name was Richard Butler. He started an organization called the Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations that spread violence throughout the Pacific Northwest. The targeting of a Jewish radio talk show host who was murdered outside of his home helped foment the environment that murdered an Ethiopian immigrant who was a young student studying on the streets of, who lived in Portland, Oregon, was beaten to death one night on the streets of Portland by a group of neo-Nazis. What we understand, though, is that why white nationalism is a threat, and indeed it's a threat. We know now through statistics, through the DOJ and others, that white nationalist violence in this country has been responsible for more murders, right, more violence than any other organized terror group inside or outside the United States. But at the end of the day, right, we also have to acknowledge that while white nationalism is a threat, that it doesn't come to our communities bringing bigotry with it, that it simply organizes the anti-Semitism, the racism, the homophobia, and the Islamophobia that already exist in our communities. The best form of defense, right, against white nationalist terror is by addressing the inequalities that already exist in our communities, the inequalities that make us vulnerable. To address the white nationalist movement, though, addressing those inequalities are not enough. We also need to understand that it is a movement that is driven by anti-Semitism. It is the core and fuel of the white nationalist movement. White nationalism is not white supremacy. White supremacy is that system of the past and present day, right, that was founded on the chattel slavery of Black people, the forced labor of African Americans, the stolen resources of Native people, and the control of sexuality or the control of women. That was the basis of white supremacy in America. None of us were around to set up that system, but all of us are responsible in addressing its legacy today. But white supremacy, that system of exploitation, is different from white nationalism. White nationalism actually has its roots in the success of the civil rights movement in this country. In fact, we couldn't see it as a backlash to the gains towards equality in the society. White nationalism is rooted in anti-Semitism because the defeat of segregation, right, by those who believed in Jim Crow and quote unquote separate but equal, that defeat was significant. But they were never going to acknowledge, even today, that they lost against African Americans who they see or saw as inferior. So they had to come up with another excuse. And that excuse was to blame Jews, right, for the success of the civil rights movement. It was drawn off of the anti-Semitic documents that formed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the forgery that purports to tell the takeover of the world by Jewish elders who met in a cemetery at midnight. That narrative has been powerful in fueling anti-Semitism in this country and the white nationalist movement. At the end of the day, anti-Semitism doesn't only threaten the Jewish community, but non-Jews as well. While Latinos died in El Paso during the massacre there by white nationalists, and African Americans were gunned down while worshiping in their own church in South Carolina, in Charleston, or the Sikh community that was terrorized in Wisconsin, or even the Jewish community at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. What we have to understand is that while those communities were targeted because they were minority, because they were Black, because they were Jewish, because they were Sikh, because they were Latino, at the end of the day, anti-Semitism provided the justification for those murders. The way that we hold white nationalism accountable in our society is by beginning the process of addressing anti-Semitism, bringing it out into the light so that we know it when we see it, so that we understand code words like globalist, Hollywood, fake news, right? Academia, liberal institutions, that these are old anti-Semitic dog whistles from the 1920s and 30s that have been brushed off for today's reality. But we also have to understand that inequality in our society provides the oxygen that the white nationalist movement needs. And so Christian story is critically important. It's important because it tells us that people do change when they are given alternatives, when they are allowed social contact across the segregated lines of America. It is about not giving up on any of us as we begin to move towards the promised land. But this story is also about accountability. How do we hold the white nationalist movement accountable for the terror and fear that it does cause in America? And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Amy to continue that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for your words. And now we hand it off to Amy.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to get to be with Eric and Christian on these panels because I always learn so much from them. And frankly, they also make my job easier because they give such an incredible overview of the ideology, of the factors that come into what motivates white nationalism and allows me to explain the work we're doing, seeking to hold this violent movement accountable. So as was mentioned, my name is Amy Spitalnick. I'm the Executive Director of Integrity First for America. We are a small civil rights nonprofit. And as was mentioned earlier, you might know us as the group that is suing the neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and white supremacists responsible for the violence in Charlottesville nearly exactly 3 years ago. Next week marks the 3-year anniversary of that awful violence. I think it's worth stepping back for a moment and remembering what happened 3 years ago, because in this day and age, with this news cycle, it's so easy to forget that something so horrific can happen in an American city. So many of us, I think, viscerally feel the emotions that we experienced when we saw the Tiki Torch March on August 11th. And I remember vividly watching the news reports, seeing these neo-Nazis and other extremists marching on the University of Virginia, carrying tiki torches, which were meant to be evocative of the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis, and shouting things like, "Jews will not replace us, all lives matter, and blood and soil." From there, they descended on the Thomas Jefferson statue in the center of campus, where they surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters, including many UVA students and community members who were there to stand up against white supremacy in their town, on their campus. And they threw fuel, lit torches, punched, beat up these counter-protesters. One of our plaintiffs who was there that evening, an African-American man, said he thought he was going to die that evening. And then the next day, I think many of us vividly remember the scenes from downtown Charlottesville. That was the day of the so-called Unite the Right rally, the guise under which these extremists had descended on Charlottesville, supposedly to protest the removal of the Robert E. Lee Confederate statue in Emancipation Park, which is right downtown. But as I'll explain in a moment, that is of course not actually what they intended to do with that weekend. But a quick refresher, these neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other extremists marched on downtown Charlottesville, where the violence was widespread and awful and extended well beyond the car attack that many of us remember so well. First, they surrounded the small local synagogue where Shabbat services were happening. Services had already been moved in an effort to avoid clashing with the neo-Nazis who had descended on this town. They surrounded the synagogue, chanting things like Sieg Heil, carrying out semi-automatic weapons, talking on their online chats about torching these Jewish monsters. The synagogue had to be evacuated, as did a number of Torah scrolls. And what always gets me, the detail that sticks with me most, is that the synagogue was home to a Holocaust scroll, a Torah that had been saved from Nazi Germany. And somehow in 2017 in America, this Torah scroll was once again under Nazi threat. And no matter how many times I read that anecdote in our lawsuit or share it, it gets me every single time, because it just so dramatically paints the horror of what was happening in an American city in 2017. Of course, the day went on and the violence continued. These neo-Nazis then charged a line of interfaith clergy, including another one of our plaintiffs, Reverend Seth Wispelway, and ultimately the day culminated in the car attack in which James Fields drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters who were peacefully walking down the street. He killed Heather Heyer, injured countless others, including many of our plaintiffs. And what's so important to understand about all of that is that nothing was an accident. Everything that happened in Charlottesville, down to the car attack, was planned for months in advance on social media, specifically on chat rooms on a social media site called Discord, which is typically used by video gamers. And in these chats, and they had many of them, many different chat rooms for the many different logistics they were planning for this awful weekend. They talked about everything from what to wear, to what to bring for lunch, to which weapons to carry, to how to, quote, crack some skulls, to whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is, of course, exactly what they ended up doing. And the meticulous way in which this violence was planned on Discord and other social media sites makes clear that, again, nothing that happened was an accident. Rather, it was a meticulously planned, racist, violent conspiracy. And so with those facts in mind, that evidence so clear, on behalf of a coalition of Charlottesville community members who were severely and grievously injured in the violence, we are taking to court the 24 neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for that violence. There is so much to say about the case. I will try to keep it short, and then I'm happy to answer any questions later in the course of the program. One of the details that I think is so remarkable about this case is that the main statute under which our plaintiffs are suing is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. This is a statute that was first passed by the Reconstructionist Congress, meant to protect recently freed slaves from Klan vigilante violence in the South. And now, nearly 150 years later, our plaintiffs are using it to fight back against the same sort of racist violence that we as a country have been unable to eradicate. And that the fact that we're using a statute that's so old, that was created to deal with the Klan in the South nearly 150 years ago, now in the year 2020, when we go to trial this fall, is stunning. And it also speaks to the fact that there are not that many differences between how these extremists operated 150 years ago and now. In the past, Klansmen would wear white robes, meet in the woods, and plan their violent conspiracies, which perhaps were targeted and constrained to their specific geographic areas. Now, because of social media and the internet, instead of meeting in the woods, they're meeting in these social media chat rooms, like the ones where where the Charlottesville violence was planned, conspiring to bring violence to communities, and then going out into the world and doing it. And so, in many ways, I think of social media as sort of the Klan den of the 21st century, providing a forum that allows these extremists to connect, to plan, and to inspire each other to action. We'll go into that, I'm sure, later in this evening as well. But why does this matter? Why does this case matter? Why are we talking about it right now? What happened in Charlottesville was not an isolated incident. As many have alluded to already tonight, it was rather a flashpoint in the larger rise of white nationalists and other far-right extremist violence in the United States. And you don't have to take our words for it. Unfortunately, if you can really draw sort of a through line from what happened in Charlottesville to so many of the subsequent attacks. First, for example, we know that the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 at Trio Life nearly 2 years ago communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders on another right-wing hate site called Gab. We know that the Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque a little bit over a year ago in New Zealand painted onto his gun a symbol that was first popularized by one of our Charlottesville defendants, Matthew Heimbach. And in turn, we know how Christ Church has inspired the Poway attack and the El Paso attack, which we just marked the 1-year anniversary of yesterday. And similarly, now during the Black Lives Matter protests, we see many of the same tools and tactics used by these extremists being utilized now in an attempt to distract from the message of racial justice, spur racial tensions, and undermine the goals of the protests that are happening on our street by fomenting violence and fear. There's so many examples there that I'm sure we might dive into later this evening, but a few core pieces that really illustrate sort of the cyclical nature of how these extremists operate. One example in which one of our key defendants, Identity Europa, which is a white nationalist organization, was the organization responsible for a now viral tweet that claimed to be Antifa and urged violence, looting in white neighborhoods. Of course, the goal there was to foment racial tensions, and that's exactly what happened. Many people, largely white men, then showed up with weapons in an attempt to defend against the Antifa threat. And this is part of the same sort of disinformation and duplicity that is central to this extremist movement. It's a core tactic of this movement. Similarly, we've seen a horrific uptick in car attacks over the last few months, many of them seemingly meant to imitate and seemingly inspired by the same sorts of online memes that were central to the Charlottesville planning, including, among many others, a KKK leader in Richmond, Virginia, who drove his car into Black Lives Matter protesters. So why does this case matter, given the fact that Charlottesville was really a flashpoint in the much larger cycle of violence? Because of the way in which this network is so deeply interconnected, we have the potential through this lawsuit not just to hold these individuals and groups accountable for the violence that they brought to Charlottesville 3 years ago, but to truly bankrupt and dismantle the leaders and the groups that are at the center of this violent movement. We are already seeing that impact firsthand. One of our defendants, Richard Spencer, complained in court the other week that this case has been financially crippling to him. Others have tried to rebrand. Some have claimed that they are leaving the white nationalist movement. Others have complained that they can't open new headquarters or go about other extremist business because of the suit. And when we go to trial this fall, put these extremists on the stand and hold them accountable for the violence that they so meticulously planned and executed, we will not just lay bare the violence that's at the core of their ideology, but we will also win large civil judgments that will have major impacts on their ability to operate and to continue spreading this violence and this hate. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I think so often about their experiences, what they lived through, and frankly, how crazy it might be to them if they were still around today, that their granddaughter has made a career of quite literally suing neo-Nazis, that in the year 2020, this is something we need to do. But I also think often about the difference between their generation in Europe and ours right now. In Europe in the 30s and 40s, they did not have a justice system that was meant to protect them. They did not have statutes like the Ku Klux Klan Act. They didn't have organizations like IFA and the other brilliant organizations represented here tonight. And that is the difference. Unlike my grandparents' generation, we have laws, we have a justice system, we have a rule of law, and it's meant to protect us, and we are using it to do so. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm so grateful to all of you for taking the time to hear us out tonight, to learn about this. And particularly as we mark the 3rd anniversary of the Charlottesville violence, it's particularly heartening and meaningful to be here with the museum and with Eric and Christian and all the brilliant work that they do. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your words and work. I wanted to we'll start with just an easy question to help us lay the groundwork. And that is, how many white nationalists are there actively in the country today?
Yeah. So this is Eric Ward, and others may have a different answer. You know, there is no hard data. It's not like folks are signing up and saying, you know, I'm a white nationalist, right? We have done some study of national surveys and surveys in Oregon, and so we'll give you kind of an idea, right? But we really don't know in terms of hard numbers. What we do know, right, is that in the United States, right, if you ask the majority of Americans, do they support white nationalism, you will receive a resounding no in most polls that have been done around the country. But if you take the tenets of white nationalism, right, and you separate it from the term white nationalism, so the idea of a white majority nation, the false idea that the United States is a European constructed country, right? If you ask the idea, the questions around interracial dating and segregation, what you then find is that over a third of white Americans are actually sympathetic to many of the core tenets of white nationalism. So while its numbers are small, its influence is quite significant, and particularly at a time, right, where the country itself finds itself in flux. So its ability to then leverage that flux, leverage that anxiety for broader gains is very real. What we can probably suspect, based off of most social movements in the United States, right, starting back to the Revolutionary War, is that most social movements comprise less than 10% of the American population. Most social movements are not widely received by the majority of Americans in the moment of their existence. So, less than 10% of British colonists, right, supported the American Revolutionary War, right? Martin Luther King, during his lifetime, right, his entire lifetime, never had the majority of white support. How small was the support for Martin Luther King? Well, in fact, Black Lives Matters today receives more support from white America than Martin Luther King or the nonviolent sit-down demonstrations did in the 1960s. And so too do we see with the white nationalist movement. It does have significant influence regardless of the small numbers.
Yeah, and I would just add to that it's impossible to know the number, but it's too big to ignore the rise in hate crimes that we've seen, the rise in rhetoric, the fact that they've been able to leverage platforms and technologies like the internet to reach more people in places they couldn't before, and some of those, that fake news and rhetoric is resonating with some people. So it is impossible to say, but what I can say is my hard numbers in terms of the people that I communicate with in terms of helping through the organization that I run, the Free Radicals Project, has skyrocketed. So I've never before in my lifetime had to respond to phone calls from mothers dealing with 10-year-olds who are now mimicking and spouting some of the rhetoric that is typical that, I'm dealing with 20-year-olds. I've never seen them leverage tactics like using video games and targeting young people in vulnerable environments, to spread their message. So, I would say that the number is impossible to measure, but it's quite high. And I would say it's rising. If we're not careful, we're living in kind of a perfect storm for extremism to exist and for these types of tropes to penetrate. We're dealing with a pandemic. We're dealing with, high, massive unemployment. We're dealing with an election that is kind of controversial on both sides. We're also dealing with this rise in this type of propaganda reaching people. So it really is this kind of perfect storm for everything happening at once. And when there's uncertainty, that's when extremism flourishes. I'm not sure that anybody on this panel or anybody watching can really clearly state what's going to happen tomorrow. We're dealing with that kind of this pandemic of uncertainty as well.
Thank you, Christian. Okay. With the rising tide of anti-Semitism and the spread of white nationalism, can you comment, and maybe each of you can, on how you feel the current administration is addressing concerns, and what steps do you think our policymakers need to take to combat hatred going forward?
I'll jump in. I think this dovetails with exactly what we were just discussing, in that there are a number of factors that lead to the rise in hate crimes, that lead to the rise in white nationalist violence and other forms of violent hate that we've seen in recent years. One of those factors is that these extremists are particularly emboldened. And in some cases, they're getting little winks and nods and dog whistles from people in the highest levels of power. And increasingly, they are getting full on embraces. And as Eric described, again, people who might not necessarily say that they support the idea of white nationalism very much do support some of the white nationalist ideas and policies that we see circulating at some of the highest levels of our government. And you can't separate the emboldened nature of the violent white nationalist movement from the role that those ideas play in our mainstream public discourse right now. And so, I mentioned earlier the major difference between white supremacists in the Ku Klux Klan in the South 150 years ago and what we're seeing now. In the past, they at least wore hoods and tried to shield their identities. Right now, you have neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and other extremists marching on Charlottesville with their faces and their names out there for the world to see, with many of them having no shame whatsoever. And they are particularly emboldened. This is compounded by the fact that the federal government hasn't just ignored the crisis of violent white nationalism, but has actively undermined efforts to address it. And sadly, the stats back this up. We know that Department of Justice civil rights investigations, the part of DOJ that was specifically created to protect people's civil rights, including folks like our plaintiffs, those investigations and prosecutions are down nearly 2/3 over the last few years. Similarly, the federal government has cut counter-extremism programs, domestic terror intelligence units at the Department of Homeland Security, and on that list can go, while some basic legislation like the Domestic Terror Prevention Act languish in Congress for years. And these are bills that wouldn't do anything that crazy. These are bills that would sort of close basic gaps in coordination reporting between levels of government, add resources to address issues like the rise of white nationalism in the military, and other core things that you would expect our government to be doing. So unfortunately, both the winks, nods, and increasingly full-on embraces these extremists are getting from people in the highest level of power, combined with the federal government's active disinvestment in combating this issue, has created, not to keep using this term, but frankly, a perfect storm, as that is only further compounded by many of the other factors we've already discussed here, including the pandemic, the moment of uncertainty we're in, and the fight for racial justice that we're seeing playing out on our streets around the country. And so it truly, you can't separate those issues. You can't separate what happened in Charlottesville and the subsequent cycle of violence from the broader dynamics at play when it comes to the federal government and our political conversation right now.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say to that is I really think Charlottesville was important also for another reason, because that's the moment I think the far right recognized they could use social media and the internet to really amplify fears, to direct their the narrative how they want to in certain cases, and to then also use it to organize even more so than they had used it prior to the Unite the Right rally. So, my caveat is, yes, to answer your question, there's nobody in the administration right now who is actively working to fight white nationalism. In fact, they are even struggling to accept that it exists in some cases. And Amy is absolutely correct. They have removed every safety net that had existed, as well as dismantled programs and removed funding from programs that were successful in combating it in the past. My word of warning, I think, to everybody is we have to be very, very careful about everything we read, everything that influences our thoughts, everything, because they understand very well that fear is a major driver in how people are reacting to certain situations. We're acting very emotional in certain ways. And in fact, we've seen just in the last couple of weeks reports of them using this whole, hoax of Antifa busloads of people coming to their towns and painting them as these, far left terrorists who are coming to shoot, white people and this and that. And of course, it's not, true at all that they were planning on doing that. So we just have to be very, very careful in this moment about what we're reading, what we're listening to, and who we choose to believe, and do our due diligence when it comes to that. That's their backbone, and disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and that controls their ability to drive how we act on certain things, good and bad.
Thank you. So this is an interesting question to follow up on the social media and piece that I want to share. We have in the audience the rabbi from Whitefish, Montana, and they were attacked in the winter of 2016-2017. And the question are the memes used by white supremacists and neo-Nazis being treated legally as hate speech?
So this is Eric Ward. And let's see if I am off mute. Good, I'm off mute, which is great. We have to be careful. So Christian just talked about fear, and fear is the friend of those who oppose democratic practice, right? And seek to try to build a moment of chaos. And one of the ways that they get us to react, right, in inducing our fear, right, is to get us to clamp down on many of the values that are important and that we value in our society. And so the quick fix has been, in terms of responding to the white nationalist movement, right, is to pass laws, right, to criminalize. And I urge people to be very, very cautious, right? First of all, justice is blind, but racism is not in America. And so most laws that we pass, even under the best intentions, tend to have a negative, disproportionate impact on people of color, right? Even if that is not the intended target. The other piece is we have to stop treating white nationalism as if it is a criminal aberration, right? There is certainly criminality and illegal acts that occur, but most of it is not, right? Most of it is a different reality that is being argued, right? A reality of ethnic cleansing. Much of it is rhetoric, right? And these aren't monsters in our closet. These are folks we go to school with, folks who we work with, right? And the answer is not necessarily criminalizing. The answer is investing in our own vision of who is an American and what will America look like. But let's be clear. While there is free speech, we are not required to give white nationalists that platform, right? That's the role of government. It is not the role of private citizens and private businesses. We do not have to construct, nor are we obligated to construct platforms of speech. And so memes, right, and imagery and flyers becomes a critically important question. One, right, white nationalists can create all the racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic memes that they want. That is their right under the Constitution. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram are not obligated to post those memes, right? That is a choice that a private company is making to open up space for imagery that we know has led to the deaths of Americans. That is an irresponsible community member if they are not addressing that. The question around, are some memes and imagery illegal? Yes, I think if they threaten physical harm towards an individual, if there's a specific time and place, right? All memes should, and posters, right, should be collected. They should be shared with organizations, free radicals, Integrity First for America, Western State Center, Anti-Defamation League, Southern Poverty Law Center, whoever you are in touch with in Montana, the Montana Human Rights Network, right? Those should be shared so folks can track and monitor. But at the end of the day, right, memes, posters get posted onto city and county property. The city and county should be trained and prepared, right, on how to deal with that when it happens, right? At the end of the day, white nationalists are causing fear, not because of white nationalist activity, but because the inactivity of our local elected governments who don't prioritize the impact that this white nationalist propaganda has in our communities. And that's how we need to focus on responses, right? It's not an issue, do we need new laws? Possibly. But the real issue here is a system failure. It is the failure of democracy to stand up for itself in this moment.
I wholeheartedly agree with Eric, as always. And I just want to underscore particularly the point about social media, which is that there is both an active effort to conflate the facts, that social media companies are somehow obligated to give space to all sides of an issue, even if one of those sides is a neo-Nazi looking to spread Holocaust denial and other forms of anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, and hate. No social media company is obligated to allow that on their platform, period. And the fact that that has been so muddied, in some cases by social media companies, in some cases by the extremists who are capitalizing on those muddied waters, is just a detriment to us all. And there has been, at least over the last few months, finally some increasing conversation about that issue, not nearly enough, and a lot of sort of finger pointing and total sort of insufficient responses from many social media companies. But I think it's so important for all of us to understand that, call it out, and as consumers decide how it impacts how we spend our time and our resources. Specifically on the question of whether some of these ideas and memes are illegal, look, if the defendants in our Charlottesville case had simply shared hateful memes and talked about their hatred and even gone and stood on the street screaming it out for the world, their conduct would have been protected. But as Eric alluded to, it's when those memes, when that other language quickly turns into real world violence, whether it be directly targeted threats or in the case of our Charlottesville lawsuit, specifically planning and then going out into the world and executing this sort of violence, that is not protected speech. And I think it's so important for all of us to understand that difference. It's for us, it's one of the reasons we're proud to have the support of certain former ACLU presidents for this case, because this is not a speech case. And as someone who wholeheartedly believes in civil liberties, we wouldn't bring a case if it was a speech case, despite the fact that many of our defendants are trying to argue that it's a speech case. This is a case about actions. And much like in many of the other circumstances where these memes and other online chatter turn into direct threats, those are actionable, much like what happened in Charlottesville illustrated how quickly this online hate and violence can turn into real world action.
I kind of liken it to these social media platforms being like apartment building managers, right? They have a responsibility to the tenants. If somebody has a swastika flag in their unit, on their wall, it's their call what they want to do about that. The minute that there are swastika stickers put in the hallway and the common areas, it's their responsibility to take a different course of action. The minute that swastika sticker is put on, a Jewish residence door, that action becomes much more immediate, much different, right? So they do have a responsibility. And I would say that, putting a meme online targeting somebody lands and has the same effect that extremists want of spray painting a swastika on a synagogue door, right? It is about the intent. So there is a nuance there. But I think that we don't have necessarily laws for online hate crimes. And so many times I think that the harassment, the abuse that happens in a virtual world has the same ramifications to the victim as if it happens in the real world. They live in fear, they live in terror, and that's their goal. So I think there is a nuance here on how we deal with this. I completely agree with Eric. I completely agree with Amy. But like everything else, it's not black and white. And I think we have to learn from this. So it's kind of new territory for everybody.
Thank you. I want to be sensitive to people's time, and it has gone quickly. So what we are going to do is I'm going to make some end closing announcements and close the formal portion of our program. And then those of you who would like to hang on and learn a little bit about what we can do and take next steps, hang on for a few minutes. We'll stick around in what I like to call the virtual lobby for about 10 minutes and get a couple more questions answered. But for those of you who need to go, I just wanted to thank you for coming to our program this evening. And in the chat, my colleague is going to put a survey. If you have a moment, please fill it out. If you don't have time now, we'll send it in a thank you letter. We want to make sure that we are on the mark and that we also are able to give important feedback to our amazing donors. Secondly, I want to invite everyone to check out our events page. We have an incredible lineup of programs coming, so please check that out. And my colleague will also be putting in the chat that information. And finally, for those of you who are local and those of you who aren't local and are thinking about coming by to Chicago, we are now open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So please stop by if you can. So thank you so much. That concludes our formal program. And now we're going to stick around for just a couple more questions. Christian, I love this question. Have you ever had a young member of the movement that you haven't been able to help? Or perhaps, what's been your toughest case to date?
Wow, both really good questions. Yeah, I think for various reasons there have been people I haven't been able to help. Sometimes it's because of restrictions on the local resources. It's easy to find help for people in places like LA or metropolitan areas like New York or Chicago. A little bit tougher in Paducah, Kentucky, to find somebody, maybe it's a therapist who is willing to work pro bono or can get over the hurdle of thinking they have to debate politics with this person. And that's my biggest hurdle is when I find resources for people, they think, but I don't know anything about the ideology. And I say, good, please don't even bring it up. Don't talk about it. Work on the person just like you would, like any other client. And that's really the best approach that I found. The toughest case that I've ever been on was not a 60-year-old grand dragon of, let me head back to answer that question. There are also times when people under great duress will use kind of the cover of disengaging to distance themselves from potential trouble that they might be getting in, the fact that they've just been doxxed or the fact that they may be involved in a lawsuit or other types of pressures that would cause them to all of a sudden, magically overnight after 30 years of being, the leader of some Nazi organization, have an epiphany. It takes much, much longer than that. Let me just say that. It takes a lot more accountability. The hardest case was not, this grand dragon. It was not some tough skinhead. It was actually a 17-year-old girl. And I talk about it pretty extensively in my book, Breaking Hate. She's Cassandra in the book, but it involved a 17-year-old girl who was being catfished, which means somebody was pretending to be somebody online while she thought that person was somebody else to try and fool her. And this person tried to be her boyfriend, was her boyfriend, virtual boyfriend. It turned out it was actually two people, one person being a 35-year-old Peruvian white nationalist man from Northern California, and another guy being a 32-year-old man in Russia, who were both collaborating with a small team of other trolls to recruit young white girls to be propagandists online. It was tough because eventually one of the men ended up abducting her, and because I had passed that information along to law enforcement, fearing that it was going to happen, I was the only person that knew where she was because law enforcement didn't act on it, and I had to be the one who had to go rescue her and bring her back to her family. That was a tough one.
Thank you, Christian. Well, you three are true, what we call at the museum, upstanders, fighting against hate. And we have an audience full of eager upstanders, and they want to know, how can they get involved? What can they do? What advice do you have for them in your organization, other organizations?
Yeah. This is Eric. I mean, I'll share what I think are three things folks can do that that are very tangible. You know, the first is you have to be in organization, right? This is not a time where individuals will have great impact. This is a time where community folks who come together or who join organizations are going to be able to have their voices heard in this moment. And it's critically important to have your voice heard. So what I say is join an organization, right? Join the Illinois Holocaust Museum, right? And Education Center. Join, you know, Integrity First for America, join Western State Center, join any organization, or you might already be in an organization. You might be in a knitting club or a real estate association or a sports club, right? Talk to those folks about something you can do. There's something you can do within that space to speak out. And I think that's important because building a new organization in the midst of a time when your house is on fire is a quite difficult task. So join and be active in supporting an organization, not just writing a check, right? But being involved in those organizations' actions. So that's one. The second is call up, you know, take a list, you know, when you get off this call, write down an elected official, right, from your local up to the federal who represents you. And each day, call one of them, leave a message, tell them what you are thinking, right? Let them know what you expect of them, right? Don't just send an email or a tweet. Pick up the phone and call their office, ask to talk to a staff person, leave a message, and keep doing that because it actually does matter. Tell them what you expect in terms of leadership around these issues. The third is you know, if you don't want to do those two things, right, join us at wedefenddemocracy.org, right? wedefenddemocracy.org. And we have tools and things that you might be able to do there. I want to liken this really quick. I don't want to turn this into a long answer, but I want to say really quickly, when I was a kid, when we were really poor, right? We were poor kids. And I talk about this, we played this game called If I Were. And, you know, it'd be like if we'd sit in a circle and we'd argue about what would happen if we were like in a lion's cage and a lion got in, or the brakes went out on the freeway, and we would argue. But the question that always came up was what if I were in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement? This is what I would have done. And boy, we would argue about what we would and wouldn't do and what we would and wouldn't put up with. We didn't understand the choices of our parents and our grandparents. We just didn't get it. So we were full of bravado. But that question has always haunted me. And I've told every audience this. That question should haunt you too. What would you have done in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement? Well, the answer is this, right? We don't have to look or ponder anymore. The truth is, whatever it is you would have done in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement will be exactly what you do when you get off of this call today. Make it count, right? This is a historical moment. Your children and grandchildren will look back and ask you what you did in this moment, right? We will all be judged. Let's lean in. Let's build the America we say we want, right? John Lewis said democracy was an idea until the 1960s, and then it became a reality. Now it is time for us to put that reality to work. And we do it by making those simple steps first.
Well, I feel like we should leave it there. And so it's hard to top that. As always, I agree. And think often about those questions as well in terms of my own family history. And I think I'm so grateful to Eric and to Christian and the museum for putting this front and center right now, and making sure that we keep thinking about what we can do in this moment. To emphasize the point that Eric was making, it's so easy for this idea to fall out of the news cycle and out of our attentions right now. The next time Trump tweets something, the next time something happens in the election, with COVID, whatever it is, those things are all important too, but do not let the issue of violent extremism fall off the radar. It too often it has. Something like El Paso happens, we talk about it for a few days and then we move on, and that can't happen. So as Eric said, keep thinking about how you're making it front and center for your friends, for your family, for your elected officials who work for you, for your community leaders, and everyone else. Specifically, in terms of organizations, if you're interested in supporting this case or getting involved in this case, there are a number of things that would be so helpful to our plaintiffs. As Eric said, don't just write a check, but if you would like to write a check, we certainly will take them, in that everything we raise directly supports this litigation, and specifically security costs in light of the many threats our plaintiffs and our team get, and evidence collection costs to ensure the phones owned by these neo-Nazis that magically fall into toilets don't have the evidence lost on them. And so if you're interested in supporting the case, you could do so at integrityfirstforamerica.org, but you can also sign up for case updates there. We have an activist toolkit where there's sample social media content, and you can use that to spread the word about the fact that this case is happening, that we're going to trial this October. And we want people to know that there is this concrete, tangible thing happening, a concrete, tangible way that people can do something in the fight against extremism, quite literally help us sue Nazis, and do something that will have major impacts that go well beyond Charlottesville, but rather have national implications in the fight against violent white nationalism. So integrityfirstforamerica.org, please sign up, donate if you can, but more than anything, please don't let this issue fall off the radar. When you are done with this call, when you wake up tomorrow, think about what you can do to keep this front and center for your communities, for your elected officials, and for everyone else in your orbit.
And real quick, I'm not a joiner, despite the fact that I joined something a long time ago. But I would say that we all have the power to affect the people closest to us, and everybody knows somebody who is involved in some kind of hateful or misconceived notion of the other or of somebody else. Unfortunately, that's the case. So we do have the power to affect the people closest to us. One of the things that I struggled with for a long time was, how do I scale what I do? And it dawned on me that we all have the ability to do what I do. What I do is not rocket science. I connect with people who people see as monsters, and I'm able to see the child and not the monster, because I know that the suit that they're wearing, that scary hate suit, is something that they've put on to protect themselves from something that they don't quite understand. And I think once you can figure that out, that nobody's actually done anything to deserve the hate that they're getting from these people, that they really hate themselves more than they hate anybody else, and they're just projecting that. So we all have the ability to affect people, or to touch the people closest to us, whether it's somebody we work with that's struggling with hate, or whether it's having the ability to empower the people who've been for so long been kept behind, the ability to lift up people of color, or people from the LGBTQ community, and give them positions that they deserve to help shape what our future is going to look like.
Wow. I think this was the perfect question to end on. And I don't know about our visitors, our audience tonight, but I'm feeling fired up with these great ideas. And thank you for these actionable items that we can all do. And we are grateful that you all three were here this evening to hear your different perspectives on such an important issue in our country. Be well, be kind. We will see everybody again. Come visit us in person. And for those of you who are on still, we will send you a recording of this amazing program that you can share with your family and communities. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you so much.